I'm thrilled to welcome back our speaker, State Archaeologist Emeritus Dr. Nicholas Bellantoni. Last year, Dr. Bellantoni fascinated us with his in-depth talk on Connecticut's great discoveries in archaeology. So I know we're going to be in store for a great program tonight as we explore the world of vampire folklore in New England. Dr. Bellantoni served as the Emeritus State Archaeologist with the Connecticut State Museum of Natural History and is an adjunct associate research professor in the Department of Anthropology at the University of Connecticut. He received his doctorate in anthropology from UConn in 1987 and later was appointed state archaeologist. His duties were many, but primarily included the preservation of archaeological sites in the state. His research background includes an analysis of skeletal remains from Eastern North America, and he's been excavating in Connecticut for almost 40 years. Dr. Bellantoni's earlier talk on archaeology in Connecticut can also be found on our YouTube channel. I think you'd enjoy that one too. So now I'd like to turn the evening over to Dr. Bellantoni. Thank you so much for being with us.
Well, thank you for having me. And I like to say it's good to be back in Reading, but I guess I'm not. But at least we're broadcasting through Reading. And so we're happy to be here for you guys. And I guess my job tonight is to get your Halloween started by telling some actual real vampire stories from New England. But one of the reasons why, this project started actually in 1990. So it's been quite a while, like 34 years. And we're still doing research on it. So it's quite still contemporary. But what I like about doing this presentation is that it's a great way to teach science because not only there's a number of disciplines that come together to help us understand and interpret what we saw in the ground archaeologically and interpret it in terms of the New England vampire folk belief. So it took osteoarchaeology, the excavation of skeletal remains, obviously history, even American literature came into play, bioanthropology, which is kind of like the analysis of the skeletal remains themselves in terms of the life history of each individual. We worked with folklorists and geneticists and finally coming to answer the question of the anomaly that we saw in the ground. And so also what I want to do is to give you a sense of, here we go, of what we do in archaeology. We are called really basically anthropological archaeologists. Big long words, I guess. But what that means is that when I do archaeology, I'm not just interested in collecting artifacts of the past. Those are raw materials, so they're important. But basically, all the analysis is trying to understand human behavior, a systematic study of human behavior in the past. We use material things because material culture is what we bring out of the ground. But we're really interested in motives of human behavior. Why do people act the way they do? And many times it's broad. We want to understand political systems, economic systems, adaptations to the environment. But then sometimes we want to understand that past in terms of, well, what we could call thought worlds. And what we see here and tonight will be kind of a cultural context of a thought world that doesn't exist. But if people think it exists, they will act a certain way. And that's exactly what we ended up having in this particular case. So let me start you off. We're going to take you back to the fall of 1990 in Griswold, Connecticut. Now, you guys are in the western part of the state. Griswold is in the eastern part of the state, off of the Quinnebog River, just north of Norwich, if that helps you geographically. But it's in the far eastern part of the state. Well, in 1990, they were sand and gravel mining this huge knoll. It's over 50 feet high. And they were mining it for construction purposes. So the sand and gravel would be loaded onto trucks and carted off to various construction sites in eastern Connecticut. Well, they stopped work on a Friday. On Saturday, 3 10-year-old boys came to the gravel bank to play, to slide down the slope and have a good old time. Well, in one jump and slide down the slope, 2 skulls dislodged and rolled down the hill with the boys. And they freaked right out, you know. One kid goes running to his mother and says, Mom, there's skulls in the gravel pit. And she didn't believe him at all. So he went back to the gravel pit and picked up the skull and brought it home and to his mother, who then climbed the wall, but then did the right thing. What she did is she called the police right away. And the police came down and roped this off as a crime scene. It turned out, some of you may remember a man by the name of Michael Ross. He was the last person put to death by the state of Connecticut. One of his victims, and he was accused of murdering a number of young women in New York and New England. And one of his victims was actually found in Griswold, Connecticut. So if you read the police report, the state police report, once they came on the scene, is they speculate that this could be one of the victims of this serial killer. But when they sent the skulls up to the state medical examiner's office in Farmington, the state medical examiner, H. Wayne Carver, at the time, recognized that these bones were old, that the skulls had, how do you want to say, they were decomposing, they had cortical loss, they were flaking. And so it was easy to see that whoever these individuals were, that they had died over 100 years ago. And that's by state statute when the medical examiner turned the investigation over to the state archaeologist, where I would then take control of the investigation. The idea is that these probably were indicative of old burials, historic burials, and as a result, they needed to be handled archaeologically. So I went down to the gravel bank, and when I did, I went down and looked up onto the high bank, and you can see a couple of slides here, and follow my cursor. What I noticed was these 6 dark stains, and here's 2 of them. You see one coming down here. This is off the soil profile now, right? This is a vertical cut. Here's another one. And what I recognized right away is that those were grave shafts, okay? You dig a hole. When you displace the hole, look at my cursor over here, through natural soils, there are a lot of bands of horizontal, various layers, color, texture, rock, and so forth. When you dig through that and displace it, and then put the coffin down, and then put the soil back in, what you've done is you've mixed, modeled, you homogenized all those various colorations into this one feature. And that is classic of a grave shaft. So I recognized right away that this was a burial ground, and that they had hit the first row of what appeared to me to be a colonial graveyard, dating probably to the 1800s would also be correct. Look here too on the slide on your right. You see the bottom of the stains. There is this level here, this layer, stratigraphic layer of cobbles. This is a layer of cobbles. So what they did, you know what? They dug down to the cobble. And then, this was all hand shoveled. They just weren't going to go any deeper. It was too much effort. So they laid the coffins down on the cobble. Okay. So when, we think everyone's buried at 6 feet, but that's, historically when they were hand shovels, 6 feet was a heart attack. You basically dug as far as you could. If you hit a level of gravel, like in this case, that was deep enough. So what we ended up having to do is what we call rescue archaeology. Basically, these burials, or at least this first row of the burials, were right on the edge of the gravel bank. And we had to remove them, hopefully in a professional and respectful way, and as completely as possible, and yet really fighting the erosion, if you will, of the gravel bank. You could see it here coming across. There's less than a foot of soil, and I'm talking about sand, between this individual and a collapse of about 50 feet down. So we had to work very gingerly, very carefully. In fact, the weight of the archaeologists, myself and our students, on the edge of the gravel bank contributed to the erosion we were trying to fight, right? Our own weight. So basically, we had to do this rescue operation to get them off as quickly as we possibly could. But meanwhile, while we're doing this, the first research question we had was, who are these people? And could we find them? So I had sent students and researchers into the town hall. They searched land deeds for this particular property, and they found that a guy by the name of Nathaniel Walton purchased this land in 1757 from his neighbor, a sea captain by the name of Stephen Johnson, in 1757 for the purposes of burying his family. Says it right in the deed. The modern development, subdivisions, shopping malls, sand and gravel mining, they only by law have to take land deeds back about 80 or so years. They do not need to go into the 18th century. So they had no idea there was a burial ground here and hadn't done that kind of research. But the Waltons came to Griswold as early as 1692, and they farmed the land for at least 4 generations, the entire 18th century. But in the early 19th century, in the early 1800s, they sold their farm and moved to what was called the Western Reserve in Ohio, Northeast Ohio, where many New England farmers, or Connecticut farmers especially, were leaving to go out and farm that less stony, less hilly soil. And the Walton family was one of those that did that. So in this rescue operation to get the members of the Walton family out, this is, just a slide showing one of my students at work and some of what we use once we get down to the burials themselves. We use only soft material like brushes, bamboo picks. We work it very carefully. The bone is in a very fragile condition. And of course, we want to be respectful, but we work very painstaking to make sure everything is recovered. We also, as you could see here, wear surgical gloves and masks. And the idea there is not necessarily for health purposes, but the issue is mostly in this situation would be if we were going to take DNA samples, we would need to be sure that we did not, as archaeologists, in handling the bones, place our own DNA onto the sample. Okay, so the precaution is to wear gloves and masks so you don't breathe onto it. Because if we do this research and do the DNA and find out that the Waltons were from Italy, then I'm in a lot of trouble. That's what's going to happen. So, the precautions are not necessarily health as much as for potential research. So when we get down to the burials, this is what the graves look like. They're extended on their back in a supine position, usually hands and arms folded across the chest or the pelvic area. But I also like to note just very quickly the forensic aspects of the human skeleton. Because of growth and development, and as we mature, we have a sexual dimorphism within our species. Males tend to be larger, taller, more bone density, and different factors involved in the skeleton. In women, more gracile than males. So, and what I'm trying to say is your skeleton records your life history, not only your age and sex, but the amount of nutrition you give it shows up on the bones, the amount of exercise you go. You guys, if you go to the gym and work out, or you get out on and are walking, that exercise that you are doing actually helps to build bone density. And we can determine the musculature, and we'll explain some of that later when we deal with some of the burials here. We could get an appreciation of the musculature of each individual. Disease states, not all diseases show up in the bones, but many cases they do, and I'll show you that. Life stress pathologies, these farmers, these colonial farmers, they worked hard. They're the stone wall builders that you have all over Reading. And, that was a hard a lifestyle. And as a result, we see that the pressures on the joints, and we see also, you know, every one of the males here in this sample of the Walton family here, all had extensive vertebral arthritis. Their backs were a mess, and it's simply a product of the life stress of their very difficult, you know, livelihoods. Trauma, obviously, broken limbs that have healed or not healed. Cause of death can be determined only through trauma. So we might be able to say that a certain individual had a certain disease and most likely died of that disease, but you can't prove that. They could have died of something else while suffering from the disease. So cause of death can only be determined if trauma is extensive enough to cause death. We could tell if a person's right-handed or left-handed. In some cases, we could tell if a woman, an adult woman, has given childbirth, and sometimes can even estimate the number of children she's had. You know, measure the long bones, and we could tell you how tall or stature of an individual. And of course, with DNA, we have really great insights into biological ancestry of each individual. So you know that old saying, "Dead men tell no tales." Forget about it. Dead men tell a lot of tales if you know how to read the bones, and the bones, unlike witnesses, never lie. So we use this kind of forensic analysis in modern criminal cases, as well as, in this case, historical reconstruction. But it's not just the osteology, it's not just the bones themselves, but also, you know, how the individual is laid in their grave. And what we saw here at the Walton's cemetery is that they were laid out in a classic colonial Christian mortuary practice. That is to say, they're laying on their back, with arms crossed, with an east-west orientation, head to the west. That means as you lay in the ground back then, you face the east. And it is believed with the second coming of Christ, Christ will come up with the sun out of the east and draw you from your housing, and you will join in the resurrection and, of course, final judgment. So in the colonial era, you had to be laid out specifically in preparation for that resurrection. Okay, we don't do this anymore for the most part nowadays. You know, in cemeteries now we have to maximize land, so we put you in like a subdivision, as many plots as we can get to maximize the burial area. But in the colonial period and into the 19th century, people were laid out east-west. Also, there are no funerary objects in Judeo-Christian tradition. It's your soul that goes on. Your mortal remains weren't really worth that much. So as a result, you're not buried with objects or anything. Today, we bury our dead with the mementos and things from our lives and our families. But back then, they didn't even bury with clothing. Cloth was expensive. Clothes were expensive. You know, everything was hand woven, right, on these machines. And you know, you couldn't afford to bury your dead with something so expensive and needed. So you passed on clothes for, you know, the family and not burying your dead. We don't see people being buried with clothes until the late 19th century, mid to late 19th century, when the industrial factories and the textile factories are getting going, and they're able to produce clothing at a cheaper rate. And as a result, wealthy families could then bury their dead with clothing. We know they were buried naked because one of the things we found, and if you again follow my cursor, you could see the triangles here. What those are evidences of shroud pins. So they were buried naked with a sheet surrounding them and pins holding the sheet together. So it gives us, you know, an idea of mortuary practice and identity within the burial ground. So here's our map of the cemetery, and actually we were 39 burials here. But for our purposes today, in terms of telling this vampire folk belief, we're going to concentrate on just this grouping. Follow my cursor. The dotted line is the gravel bank edge, the cliff. And you'll note that there were 3 burials here in a row. And they would have brass tacks on the lid of their coffins that survived, providing the initials and age of death of each of the individuals. But these are the 3 that are the most prominent in our vampire story. So remember I told you I arrived at the gravel bank, I looked up on the hill and I could see these dark stains and recognized the first row of an old cemetery. Well, at the bottom of one was a brick box, a square of like bricks. And at first I thought, well, maybe it housed a tombstone. But as you could see here, as we cut back from the cliff, it wasn't housing a tombstone, it was actually a crypt. And what they had done is they laid the coffin down. You could see the darkened coffin in the middle. They built a row of bricks around it, actually up about 7 high. And then with these flat field stones here, they covered the top of the crypt. So being in charge of the excavation, I felt the responsibility to open the crypt. And when I did, I looked down on the darkened lid of the coffin. You could see the wood preserved fairly well here. And I recognized that around chest high, if you could follow this now on this slide, they had taken brass tacks and they hammered the initials NB, and underneath the initials, the number 13. Now, when I opened the crypt and looked down on the initials NB, I wasn't a happy camper because those are my initials. I opened a crypt, I looked down, and there's my initials on the coffin. And I wasn't too thrilled about the number 13 either. But I remember saying to one of my students as we were proceeding through this, we're supposed to be in the Walton family cemetery, but we've got a surname here that begins with a B. Who will be family? And I remember I had a student after we were done in the field and back at UConn, came into my office all excited. He said, I got him. I said, what do you got? He said, I found a Nathaniel Bennett, NB, marries into the Walton family in 1794. I said, that's really cool. I said, can you associate the number 13 with this Nathaniel Bennett? And he said, I've got that too. It turns out he died on October 13th, which happens to be my birthday. So this guy has my initials. He dies on my birthday, and I'm digging him up. Actually, it turns out it's not Nathaniel Bennett. In fact, Nathaniel Bennett, based on the family genealogy, married into the Walton family, but ended up having something like 6 kids. The person laying in this crypt skeletally was 13 years old. It was an adolescent. So it wasn't Nathaniel Bennett. Laying next to NB was a woman who, and you could see here, had no crypt. We know she's a woman from her adult woman from her skeleton. She skeletally, bioanthropologically, she's 45 to 55 years of age, something like that. Noted a couple of things. Her skull's not here. She's not decapitated. Basically, what has happened is that this is one of the burials that the skull rolled down the hill here with the boys on the initial discovery of the burial ground. So as a result, and we were able to match up one of the skulls with her postcranial remains and so forth. But she had brass tacks. Here's a close-up of it that had a B period and a 6. Also on the right thigh here, you could watch my cursor again, you could see there are more tacks up here, which look like an I. Potentially it looked like IB 60 or something like that. We're not quite sure. The problem was because of decomposition. Her whole coffin, because it was not in a crypt, had deteriorated, decomposed through time. And the only thing that survived of that coffin is where the brass tacks were situated. And that's because the tacks, they erode, they leach copper salts into the soils around them, and as a result, enhanced organic preservation. So part of the wood did preserve only where the brass tacks had been situated. So we have an adult woman. We know she's part of the bee family, but we don't know too much about her. But laying next to her, also in a crypt, this time a stone-lined crypt, burial number 4, is, well, the star of our show, I suppose. When I came along this gravel bank, this would have been, all of this, the slide that you're seeing, the soils would have been all covered here. I would have only saw this opening where the flat field stones were set and arched, okay? And I could see the skull kind of looking at me, and I said, gee, that's kind of odd, not right anatomically is what I'm thinking, but I didn't think too much more of it as we went down. When we would open up the burial, the crypt, again, removing the flat field stones, we found the wooden coffin lid. It had survived in fragments pretty well, and it had the initials JB 55. So robust adult male, 55 years of age. So we get these little clues that help us not only biologically to see if the skeletons match up to these in terms of age and sex, but also, gives us something to go by historically as to who these people might be. We know the Waltons, but unknown who the Bee family is. So when I continued down excavating onto, and this is a photograph looking down onto the crypt, and you could see the flat field stones here. This is all in the background, this mound in the back. This is the cliff right on the edge here. As I coming down on it, I found 2 skeletal elements on top of the stone. One was an ulna, lower arm bone, and a lumbar vertebrate from the lower back. And I'm saying to myself, this guy's supposed to be inside the crypt. Why am I finding body parts outside the crypt? And it wasn't until we finally opened the whole crypt up that we saw why the bones have been displaced. And that is, it was a burial, a skeleton that had been totally rearranged in their grave. So if you look at the bottom of the slide, okay, you can see the shin bones or the tibia and the feet, right, all perfectly anatomically at the foot of the coffin. But up here, where the thigh bones or femur should be, they had been uprooted, and here they are, crossed over the chest. The chest had been violated, and now it was pretty clear that the skull or cranium had been deliberately decapitated from its anatomical position and rotated to face the west. And I was totally befuddled as to what I was looking at. I had never seen a grave like this and had no idea what we were looking at. First thing I thought was Jolly Roger, right? Crossbone and skulls, right? I said, man, I remember making a joke that maybe this guy's a pirate. Who knows what's going on here? But we knew something else was going on too. One of the things, and follow my cursor again, you see, this is the femur. This is the ball of the femur that goes into your hip socket, right? And down here would be your knee joint. But if you could look at the back of the posterior of the femur here, you'll see a crack in the bone, okay? That means when they did this rearrangement, the bone fractured. Okay? We could tell by that fracture, the signature of that fracture, that whatever happened, this rearrangement occurred probably 5 or so years after this guy died. In other words, JB was given a good Christian burial. He's laid in the ground, east-west orientation, head to the west, anatomical, waiting for the day of resurrection. 5 years later, somebody comes into his grave and rearranges him. And of course, the question is, why? What's going on? I remember my first thoughts were vandalism, because I had no real good explanation. And I said, well, maybe they broke into this guy to steal something, rings or jewelry. But that didn't hold very well. First of all, you can never use negative evidence in archaeology. If it's not there, it's not there, right? You can't invent that it was there, or if it's not there, it's not there. You can't use negative evidence. But when you look at all the other 30 burials, not a single artifact of any kind was found other than shroud pins and coffin hardware. And besides, if you were going to steal something like jewelry, you didn't need to rearrange this guy like they did. Something else was going on, but I had no idea what it might be. And then one of my colleagues came to me and said, well, have you ever heard the story of the Jewett City vampire? And I said, no, I hadn't, but please do tell. Well, the story, it's about the Ray family in Jewett City in the mid-19th century. They were victims of a disease they called back then consumption. You call it tuberculosis, okay? Consumption was sometimes a chronic disease that one had for a while, and where the individual, coughing up blood, it's pulmonary, but people looked like they were wasting away. They got weaker and paler. They still ate. They had appetites evidently, but they were wasting away, like something was sucking the life out of them. Why? It was called consumption. Something was consuming them. Well, in the Ray family, it turns out that they have a young son, a 24-year-old, who dies of the disease, consumption. They bury him at Jewett City Cemetery. The father, 2 years later, Henry Ray, comes down with the disease and he dies. 2 years after that, a 26-year-old son in 1851 contracts tuberculosis and he dies. All three are buried in the cemetery. Well, then in 1854, another son, Henry Jr., actually became stricken with the disease. And the family's in a panic. They can't stop the deaths. Doctors couldn't help them. The churches couldn't help them. They couldn't stop the dying within their family. And so through a folk belief, they were told that they needed to go into the graves of the father and the two brothers that had died earlier, dig into them and conduct an experiment. That is to say, to determine which one might still be alive. That is to say, undead in their grave. And if they found a member of the family undead, they needed to put them to rest, make them dead, okay? So they go into the cemetery, they dig up the father and both brothers to see if they were not in a state of decomposition. They found one of the brothers, and actually it was the one that died, or the most recent death, still had a fresh heart. So what had happened is that in decomposition in the soil, they started to obviously break down right away, but the one that had just recently died still had some soft tissue involved, and what they interpreted as still remnants of the heart. And as a result, they burned him in his grave. They set his grave completely on fire. And the brother kind of inhaled the smoke that they were trying to save as a remedy. And I said, well, that's a really interesting story. You got any more like this? And yeah, there's the case of the Brown family in Exeter, Rhode Island in 1892. In this case, it seems it's the women in the family that are contracting consumption tuberculosis. Mercy dies, her sister dies, Mary, and her mother dies. And her brother, Edwin, comes down with the disease. In order to save Edward, they dig into the mother and the two daughters. Turned out Mercy was the last one to have passed, and so she was still relatively fresh in the grave. And they interpreted that to mean that she remained undead, and that she could leave the housing of that grave, feed on her brother, and hence spread the disease to living family members. That's exactly what the thought process was here. They were leaving spiritually. We don't know. Physically, we don't know the nature that the vampire takes, but we knew the fear was that the dead were spreading the disease. So in this case, what happened is they took Mercy's heart, they burned it at the blacksmith's fire in town, and they took the ashes, they made a potion with it. I'm sure they mixed it with water. I'm not quite sure what. And Edwin, the brother, drank it. Again, as a folk medicine to ward off. So we were really now confronted with this whole idea of vampirism. And with that, I met Michael Bell, who is a folklorist in Rhode Island. And Michael, is you see him on your left in the black sweater rather. He had been studying the New England vampire folk belief for, like 6 years before I found JB. And the question of whether JB was in fact considered a vampire. And he took me, I remember he took me to this cemetery in North Smithfield, Rhode Island. And look at this cemetery that we're walking through. It's completely overgrown, completely overgrown. The tombstones are in the middle of a woods and vegetation has grown up. But he wanted to take me to this stone. You see this beautiful slate stone. And at the bottom of the epitaph, it's a young man who dies at 27 years of age. But the epitaph at the bottom, follow my cursor again. Okay, you can't read it very well, but it says consumption's vampire grasp. First time I had ever seen the connecting of a vampire and consumption. It's right there. So I want to know, where did this come from? And our colleague, Dr. Faye Ringel, who's now retired like myself, she taught English and American history at the Coast Guard Academy down here in New London. She found a book called Black Sister. It's poetry by Black American women, from the mid 18th century right into the late 20th century. And she found a poem to the memory of a J. Horace Kimball. And part of the poem reads, although consumption's vampire grasp had seized thy mortal frame, thy ardent and inspiring mind, untouched, remained the same. In other words, the vampire can get your mortal frame. He can kill you, but he can't take your mind. He can't take your soul. He can't take what inspires you. So here it is in literature. Here it is in cemeteries. Here it is in an archaeological excavation. So where did this idea come from? This concept of, oral traditions and folklores about the undead. We looked into everything. We looked into 17th century witchcraft here in New England to see if there was a connection with a vampire. Nothing. We even looked at Native American beliefs and oral traditions, found no connection. But what we did find is a connection between Eastern Europe and New England. And that is that the concept of the dead and disease, and that the tradition of the undead capable of leaving the grave and feeding on living family members associated with diseases like tuberculosis were primarily of Eastern European. And of course, the diaspora goes all over. And understand that many cultures worldwide believed in the concept of the undead. Even the Egyptians, the ancient Egyptians believed in such a thing. So, what these families coming in Europe, and then many doctors possibly, we believe, coming from Europe, maybe have prescribed the experiment of going into the graves and find out if your loved ones remained undead. And if so, put them to rest to save your family. Now, understand, this is before germ theory. This is before we had an understanding of, the mycobacteria that causes tuberculosis. They had no idea. They had to understand it was contagious, but they didn't understand how. So, doctors couldn't help them. They had no clue either back then. And so you had tubercular victims in these large farming families living in these unsanitary compounds. And let me tell you, the houses were unsanitary based on our concepts of cleanliness today. But the point is, you had tubercular victims sitting at the dinner table coughing and coughing, and nobody's covering their mouths. Nobody, taking precautions. They had no clue. That same tubercular victims were sleeping in bedrooms with brothers and sisters, 5, 6 in a room, coughing all night long, spreading the disease. It was epidemic, especially in rural farming families. And it was an epidemic in city and urban cities where during the Industrial Revolution, factory workers, people were coming from all over the world, especially Europe, to work in the factories in America. And they lived in slums. And tuberculosis was epidemic. We get another glimpse of this in terms of these traditions coming from Europe, based on some of the historic documents we have. This is a copy of the Connecticut Current. Okay, the Connecticut Current is the oldest continuous operating newspaper in the country. Today, we call it the Hartford Current, okay? But back in the colonial era, it was called the Connecticut Current. And this is the front page of Monday, January 21st, 1765. And follow my cursor. You can't read the headline, folks, because it's just not clear enough, I'm sure, and it's in the small type print here. But the headline is Vampires. And it tells the story of sailors coming over from Europe with a concept of the undead and how to save your loved ones by putting the undead to rest. So we've got a pretty good connection with Europeans coming here with the idea of the folklore. Now, the date, 1765. Now, consumption wasn't as big a problem in 1765. Smallpox was, and smallpox will continue through the 19th century. But when you get into the early 19th century, the early 1800s, populations are increasing, more people are coming over here, more immigration, and what ends up happening is you've got larger populations, and tuberculosis really, as a contagious disease, really spurts. And so while the thought of vampirism is around, it's probably not acted upon until consumption becomes an epidemic. And then we need to do something. It's worth the try when all else fails. So when we look at European oral traditions, we see, the concept of vampirism associated with exhuming the dead to conduct experiments, looking for blood in the heart. There are many different ways of getting rid of the vampire, saving the living. In some cases, the heart is burned. In some cases, the skeleton is rearranged, including decapitation. In some cases, the heart, when it's burnt, is the fumes are breathed in, taken in by the patient that they're trying to hopefully save. Or in fact, as we saw in Mercy Brown's case, a potion was made and it was drunk. There are another way to get rid of the vampire too, or put the vampire to rest, is turn them over in their grave. So they now lay face down in the coffin. So there are a number of different ways to look at this. Michael Bell, in his research, when he put this map together, he had something like 40 cases in Connecticut that he had recorded. Now, these are from family diaries. These are from newspaper articles. These are from town records where where a family comes to the town who may operate or own the cemetery. Excuse me. they come to the town and say, we want to conduct an experiment. We want to dig up, we want to go into the grave of my daughter or something like that. So if you look at Michael's map from that time period, here's Griswold, Connecticut down here. But look at this activity. Western Rhode Island and Eastern Connecticut were literally a hot spot for this activity. Nothing out here in Reading, okay? You guys are safe. But really, Eastern Connecticut, Western Rhode Island, Massachusetts, Vermont, New Hampshire, all had cases. And but primarily, it's a rural New England phenomenon. So one of the things I wanted to do was, could we test this hypothesis of vampirism in terms of JB and what we found? So what we do is, in these cases, is we develop what we call test implications. So based on historical documentation, accounts we have, you know, what kind of test implications can we put up to allow us to test the hypothesis? So we do know from Michael Bell's research that the historic accounts go primarily from the 1790s to the 1890s. Now, that said, we have a case in Wilmington, Connecticut that's in the 1780s. And Michael has found some cases in the early 20th century now. But primarily, this is about 100 years of primarily the 19th century. In every case that Michael has been able to record, the vampire belief occurs among rural farming families. And like I mentioned, predominantly Western Rhode Island, Eastern Connecticut, Vermont, and New Hampshire. In every case, the suspected vampire dies of consumption or tuberculosis, right? And it could involve removal of the heart and rearrangement of the grave. So how does all of this stand up in terms of the archaeology and the bioanthropology that we have? So here's the cranium and the jaw of JB. He's very robust. So look at follow my cursor. Look at the brow ridge. It's very rugged. He's got a very prominent nose. Look how his jaw flares over here at the gonial angle, and you could see the big pocket here where the muscle, the muscles of your jaw would fit. This guy's very rugged. He's got a very robust chin, and this is one of the facial reconstructions we have from him. Note that he has an interesting smile, right? And that's because, you know, back in those days, almost nobody owned a toothbrush. Almost nobody ever saw a specialist called a dentist. And we have seen colonial era and early historic era, early republic era mouths, if you will. Dental health is atrocious. These people ate diets rich in sugars and carbohydrates, no brushing, no floss. And so it was not uncommon for people to lose a lot of teeth, and especially an individual that's 55 years of age. Actually, for 55, JB's doing pretty good. He's doing pretty good. We have seen colonial era skeletons that 20-year-olds are already losing their teeth through periodontal disease. Okay, so this is actually, he's doing pretty well for his time period. Here he is in profile. Again, note the dentition, but look at that brow ridge. Look at that prominent nose, a very thin, prominent nose. I mean, this pronounced chin. This is called the mastoid process. This is where your neck bone comes in, that comes down to the center of your neck here, and it attaches to your cranium. Thick, rugged. This guy is strong. And when you look at his postcranial remains, the bones are thick with density. This guy is a good, hard working farmer. His bones are strong. And the muscle attachments are very robust. Okay, so he's pretty prominent. He's a very strong man, but he also has some pathologies. And primarily what he has is, if you look over here, the vertebral column, as I mentioned earlier, is loaded with arthritic condition. This lipping you see coming around here, as well as here, is all the result of osteoarthritic condition. His backbone was littered with arthritis. Again, a stone wall builder, okay? This is his clavicle or collarbone. This is not natural. This is all regenerated bone because of a fracture. So in fact, we found fractures on his left clavicle, his rib, and around the knee area. They all healed. This shows that this growth here, this all healed. And he probably lived at least 5, 6 years or more, probably 10 years or more after this injury. But of course, we could see it on the bone. So tough life, hard life. And he's reminiscent of it. So he's got broken and healed fractures, classic European characters on the skull, and we'll talk about the DNA in a moment. Strong, robust. When we measured his long bones and did his stature, he's 6 feet tall. That's really tall in those days. Abraham Lincoln was our tallest president at 6'4", and he was considered a giant at his time. So 6 foot in the late 18th, early 19th century. This guy is very robust. But here's the kicker. We know that he suffered from tuberculosis, okay? He has 4 lesions, tubercular lesions on his left ribs. And here's what they look like. This is one slide. See this grayish, whitish kind of triangle? That's the anterior of the rib, okay? That is the rib, that the inside of the rib cage that faces or adheres to the lung area, okay? The pulmonary. These are typical lesions we see in pulmonary diseases like tuberculosis. Now, doesn't say 100% he had tuberculosis, but he definitely had a pulmonary disease very much like tuberculosis if he didn't have it. If he didn't have consumption, he had something very close to it. And when you look at that time period, consumption is the primary deal. Here's another view of the lesions. This is near the head of the ribs, okay? And you could see the lesions here, the staining that. Now, in order for it to get into the bone like this, you have to have consumption tuberculosis in a chronic condition, okay? You contract tuberculosis, you die within 6 months, say. Like it's going to invade your soft tissue, it's going to be what kills you. But it's not going to invade the hard tissue of the bone unless you have it in a chronic condition. So what this tells us is that this JB guy had not only had tuberculosis or disease very much like it, but he had it for a long period of time, okay, in a chronic condition. So when we put the hypothesis together and we look to support or refute it, first of all, we look at the burial is arranged consistent with folklore, the folk methods, mostly the burning of the heart, but not likely a heart would have been here 5, 6 years later. That's back in. The cemeteries in rural Eastern Connecticut are a real hot spot for the vampire folk belief. And in fact, only 2 miles from Jewett City in the reported vampire event of the Ray family. The temporal period is early 19th century. When we looked at his coffin, what was left of his coffin, we were able to determine that was a style of coffin used in the late 18th, early 20th century with the brass tacks and all of that. And then the forensic evidence of the tuberculosis on JP's ribs was really the kicker. Everything seems to fit the vampire folk belief. The only thing that is not consistent is the dramatic rearrangement of JB. We see some cases where there's some minor arrangement, but this is dramatic. And I think what was going on here, if the vampire folk belief is correct, is that by the time they went back into this guy's grave years later, the soft tissue was all gone. They were probably looking for the heart to see if it was still there. We know that because he has ribs that were damaged when they went back into him. He had broken ribs that were healed, but he also had ribs that we found that were fractured because of this rearrangement activity. So they were searching for heart, is my point. But they probably didn't find it because it had decomposed. So they might have found themselves with a kind of a predicament. They dug into this guy to see if he was a vampire, but all the soft tissue is gone. So did that mean he was not a vampire? Our hypothesis would say that there's somebody in the family that's dying of consumption, and they need to make a decision. Maybe he's not a vampire, but maybe he is, and he's killing someone else in his family. So I think what they did at this point was they decided to err on the side of caution, conservatively. So what they did, they uprooted his legs and crossed it, probably so he couldn't leave the housing of his grave. They decapitated him so that he would be dead, not just dead. And so I think this dramatic rearrangement, which is not something we don't see in the historic record, I think it's a result of the fact that there was no soft tissue left for them to interpret. And so they decided to be conservative in their interpretation and just put him to rest. So who was JB? When we started this research way back when, it was really inconclusive who the B family was. When we looked at the town records in Griswold, well, we found a lot of candidates. We found Bennetts, Bishops, Burnhams, Browns, Bissells, Burtons, and Barbers, all living in Griswold at the time. And probably interacting with the Walton family. But we couldn't tell which one. We never found those JB initials or anything we could, really put our teeth into. And by the way, this is a more recent facial reconstruction of JB done by our colleagues at Parabon. So we didn't know. But fortunately, as time went on, better and better techniques at DNA quantification became available to us. And we worked with our colleagues at the Armed Forces Medical Examiner's Office down in Washington, D.C. This is part of the Armed Forces DNA identification laboratories. And we ran two samples on JB. And if you follow my cursor, he really comes in these are the two samples. They fall into this very blue bunch of spots. Those are Europeans, as you can see down here, okay? Actually, it belongs to what we call a haploid group R1b. Basically, that is this section of Eastern Europe. So we know genetically, he's consistent not only with European ancestry, but Western European ancestry, and most likely, came from the United Kingdom, somewhere in the British Isles, based on that. But then what we did is we took those DNA tests and we compared them with what's called Modern Tree DNA RIB project, okay? And what that is DNA from various family trees that people have donated. So you guys, you give your DNA to Ancestry or National Geographic or wherever you send it to, so you can get a reading on where you're from, okay, where your ancestry is from, and all of the diverse places your past comes from is what you really find out about. Well, that goes into a database, and as a result, we can look at these databases now and try to match up with our archaeological sample. And when we did this, the surname Barber listed positively in both tests. Very compelling. And Katie Gagnon, who's done a lot of our historic research, found the barbers in the Hale Index. The Hale Index is an index, statewide Connecticut index that was put together in the 1930s, where a guy by the name of Charles Hale and his crew of workers, it was basically part of the Roosevelt administration, work progress administration, to put unemployed men to work. They basically went to all the ancient burial grounds in the state of Connecticut and recorded not only the location, but the inscriptions on their tombstones, which was really important to us because a lot of times those inscriptions are no longer legible today. And in many cases, they're missing. So it's a valuable index. And she found the barber. She found a John Barber, JB, who died in 1845, and he had a son, Nathan Barber, NB, who died at 12 years of age in 1826. And these look like really good matches for MB13 and JB55. Now, you could say, well, NB is 13, but the historic record says he's 12. Okay, close enough. But there's a reason for that discrepancy. When you read, on an old tombstone, it'll say AE, the Latin of for age of, and the number AE 13. Okay. The way they calculated that back then was they calculated it based on your year, from the year you're born. Okay. So, the way we do it, when you're in your first year of life, you're so many months old. But when you hit your first birthday, you are now 1 year old. You've already been alive for a year, but now you're 1 year old. And you don't become 2 years old until you complete the next cycle. Well, in the ancient, when you see the AE for the Latin, you're in your first year, the first year you're born. So NB13 is really 12 years old. I just had a birthday, October 13th, right? You all know that now. And I just turned 76. So on my tombstone, it'll read AE 77 because I'm in my 77th year. So that's the discrepancies here between what we saw on the coffins and what we see in the historic record. So here it is. Here's the Hale Index. Now follow my cursor here. You see down here for August 9th, 1826, we have, here we are, Nathan Barber, NB, Griswold, son of John, died on July 27th at the age of 12. So we've got, here's some historic records of this family that seem to match up. So what do we know about John Barber? Well, if it's the right John Barber that we think it is, he was born in 1788, died in 1845. So that means he was probably exhumed sometime around 1850 or more, okay? Remember the Ray family, that was 1854. So Barber would have been a contemporary of the Ray family and obviously sharing folklore information among them. We know he was a veteran of the War of 1812. He married Hannah Green in 1808 in Bellantoni, Connecticut, which is just to the north of Griswold. He had 3 sons, all of which die young, but we don't have any records as to what they died of. Could it have been consumption? Could they have been, why he was dug up to protect them? He also had 5 daughters, he and Hannah, 4 of which lived to ripe old ages for the time period. So we don't, there's a lot of things we're still trying to put together here. Some matches up, but some we have no answers for. We did find a New London County map dating to 1854. This is really a great map for us. Follow my cursor. You see up here, Walton Turn. This was where the Walton Farm was. This is Henry Johnson in 1854. His father was Stephen Johnson, the sea captain that the Waltons bought the burial ground from, actually the top of a hill, 6 rods by 4 rods or something like that, to denote where the burial ground was. The Johnson House, by the way, still stands in Griswold. The burial ground would have been right about here. See my cursor rotating where the bend in that brook comes